August 1944. The fields of Normandy were scarred by weeks of relentless battle. In a battered farmhouse near the shattered city of Caen, a Canadian general named Guy Simons stood alone, staring at a table covered in maps. The air was thick with the smell of cigarette smoke and damp stone, but Simons barely noticed. Outside, the thunder of artillery was constant, shaking the windows and rattling the nerves of everyone inside. But for Simons, the real storm was happening inside his mind. He wasn't thinking about the enemy across the fields. He was thinking about the men who wore the same uniform as him, the officers he had trained with, trusted, and led into battle. Just hours before, he had watched another attack fall apart, another hill left in enemy hands, another chance to end the war slipping away. Every hour, more German soldiers were escaping through a gap in the Allied lines near a small French town called Falaise. Every hour that gap stayed open, thousands of enemy troops slipped away to fight another day. For Simons, every one of those escapes meant more American and Allied lives would be lost in the months to come, in Holland, in Belgium, maybe even on German soil. The pressure was crushing. The Allies had landed in Normandy on D-Day, and now, after months of brutal fighting, the endgame was in sight. The plan was simple on paper: close the Falaise Gap, trap the German armies, and maybe, just maybe, bring the war in Europe to a sudden, shocking end. But simple plans rarely survive contact with reality. The Canadians were supposed to attack from the north, the Americans from the south. If they could meet in the middle, they'd slam the door shut on nearly 100,000 German soldiers, including some of Hitler's most battle-hardened troops. It was a chance to change the course of history. But as Simons looked at the maps, he saw more than just lines and arrows. He saw the faces of young men from across North America, farm boys from Saskatchewan, factory workers from Detroit, college kids from New York, who had come to fight for freedom. He knew that every decision he made would decide who lived and who died. And now, with the fate of the entire campaign hanging in the balance, Simons realized the real threat wasn't just the enemy in front of him. It was the weakness within his own command. What happened next would become one of the most controversial and little-known stories of World War II. Simons would make a decision that no general ever wants to face. He would turn his focus away from the enemy and instead look at the men standing beside him, the officers he had trusted with everything. In a move that would shock his army and change the course of the war, Simons would quietly remove his own commanders, ending their careers in a single, cold moment. It was a choice that would save lives, but it would also haunt him for the rest of his days. This is the untold story of how one general's ruthless decision behind closed doors shaped the fate of thousands, and why the echoes of that moment still matter today. If you think you know the story of D-Day and the battle for Normandy, think again. The real drama was happening far from the front lines, in the shadows, where the hardest choices are made. And what happened in that farmhouse would send shockwaves through the Allied armies, changing the way wars are fought, even to this day. The summer of 1944 was a turning point not just for Europe, but for the entire world. After the storm of D-Day, American and Allied forces had clawed their way through the hedgerows of Normandy, inch by bloody inch. Now, the fate of the war in Western Europe hung on a single, electrifying opportunity: the chance to trap Hitler's armies in a pocket near a small French town called Falaise. For the Allies, this was more than just another battle. It was the moment that could break the back of Nazi Germany. Imagine the map. To the north, Canadian and British troops, battered but determined, pushing south from Caen. To the south, American divisions, battle-hardened, relentless, driving north under the command of General Patton. Between them, a shrinking corridor, the infamous Falaise Gap, through which the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were desperately trying to escape. Inside that pocket were nearly 100,000 German soldiers, hundreds of tanks, and enough artillery to turn any battlefield into a nightmare. If the Allies could close the gap, they wouldn't just win a battle, they'd destroy two entire German armies in one stroke. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Every hour the gap stayed open, more German troops slipped away, veterans who would regroup, rearm, and fight again in places like Holland, Belgium, and even deep inside Germany. American commanders knew what was at risk. The longer the Germans held out, the more American lives would be lost in future battles. The pressure was on to finish the job, to slam the door shut and end the war months ahead of schedule. But the Germans weren't going down without a fight. The Falaise Gap was defended by some of Hitler's most fanatical SS Panzer divisions, elite units who had sworn to fight to the last man. The terrain was flat, open, and deadly. There was nowhere to hide from the eyes of German gunners. Every field, every hedgerow, every crossroads was a killing ground. For the Americans and their Canadian allies, the mission was clear but brutal. Attack head-on, break through the enemy's strongest defenses, and link up before the Germans could escape. On paper, it sounded simple. In reality, it was a nightmare. The Canadians had tanks, artillery, and the courage of young men from across North America. The Americans brought overwhelming firepower and the momentum of victory. But the Germans had experience, cunning, and the desperation of men who knew they were fighting for their lives. The battle for the Falaise Gap would become a race against time, a deadly contest where every minute counted, and every mistake could cost thousands of lives. As the Allies closed in, the world watched. Newspapers in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles ran headlines about the trap that could end the war. Families across America held their breath, hoping their sons would be among the lucky ones to come home. The generals knew the eyes of history were on them. The pressure to succeed was overwhelming. But as the fighting raged, cracks began to show. Attacks stalled, orders were delayed, opportunities slipped away. The Germans, sensing a chance, poured everything they had into holding the gap open just a little longer. For the men on the ground, it was chaos, smoke, fire, and the constant roar of battle. For the commanders, it was a test of nerve, skill, and leadership. The Falaise Gap was more than just a battlefield. It was the crossroads of destiny, where the future of Europe and the lives of thousands of American and Allied soldiers would be decided. And as the hours ticked by, one question haunted every commander. Would they seize the moment, or would history remember them for what slipped through their fingers? But the real crisis was still to come. Because sometimes, the greatest danger isn't the enemy in front of you, it's the weakness within your own ranks. And what happened next would force one general to make a choice that would change everything. While the world's attention was fixed on the thunder of tanks and the roar of artillery in Normandy, a quieter, more dangerous crisis was brewing behind Allied lines. It wasn't about firepower or strategy. It was about trust. In the chaos of war, every army depends on its leaders. But what happens when those leaders start to falter at the very moment they're needed most? For the Canadian Army, the answer to that question was becoming painfully clear. In just 5 years, Canada's military had exploded from a tiny peacetime force into a massive war machine. Before the war, the entire Canadian Army was smaller than a single American division. By 1944, it had swelled to over 700,000 men. But there was a catch. You can't create experienced commanders overnight. Many of the officers leading Canadian troops in Normandy had never faced real combat before. They were promoted quickly, sometimes more for seniority than for skill. Some were brave and brilliant. Others were simply untested, and the battlefield is a harsh place to learn. General Guy Simons, the man at the center of this storm, saw the warning signs everywhere. Attacks that started strong but fizzled out. Units that reached their objectives but failed to push forward. Orders that came too late or not at all. These weren't dramatic failures that made headlines. They were small, almost invisible cracks in the foundation. But in war, even the smallest mistake can cost lives. For every hour the Falaise Gap stayed open, more German soldiers escaped, and more American and Allied troops would pay the price down the road. Simons knew that the enemy wasn't just across the fields. Sometimes. The real threat was standing right beside you, wearing the same uniform, carrying the same flag. He began to question whether his division commanders were up to the challenge. Could they make the split-second decisions that meant the difference between victory and disaster? Could they inspire their men to keep moving when everything seemed lost? Or would hesitation and uncertainty doom the entire operation? The pressure was relentless. American generals like Patton and Bradley were famous for their aggressive, no-nonsense leadership. They demanded results and they got them. But in the Canadian ranks, old habits died hard. Promotions had often been based on loyalty, connections, or years of service, not on battlefield performance. Now, with the fate of the campaign hanging in the balance, those old ways were being put to the ultimate test. Simons wasn't alone in his doubts. Whispered conversations among staff officers revealed growing unease. Some commanders seemed overwhelmed by the chaos of battle. Others hesitated at critical moments, missing opportunities that would never come again. The cost of these failures wasn't measured in lost ground. It was measured in young lives cut short, in letters home that would never be answered. For American viewers, this story hits close to home. The U.S. Army faced similar challenges in World War II, rapidly expanding and promoting officers at breakneck speed. The difference was that American commanders like Eisenhower and Patton were ruthless about removing anyone who couldn't deliver. In Normandy, the Canadians were about to learn that same hard lesson. As the days dragged on and the Falaise Gap remained open, Simons realized he was running out of time and out of patience. The question he faced was brutal. What do you do when the problem isn't the enemy in front of you, but the leaders beside you? What do you do when the men you trusted are failing the soldiers they command? The answer would require a level of cold-blooded resolve that few commanders possess. And as the crisis deepened, Simons knew that the next decision he made would define not just his own legacy, but the fate of thousands of men fighting for freedom on the fields of France. But before he could act, the world needed to understand the man behind the uniform, the relentless, ice-cold general who would soon make one of the most controversial decisions of the entire war. To understand the storm brewing in Normandy, you have to know the man at its center. Guy Granville Simons wasn't your typical Canadian general. In fact, he was an outsider in almost every way, a man who never quite fit the mold but who would end up reshaping the fate of an entire army. Born in England in 1903, Simons moved to Canada as a child, carrying with him the discipline and ambition of an immigrant determined to prove himself. He graduated from the Royal Military College in 1925, but unlike many of his peers, Simons never stopped pushing himself to learn more, to think deeper, to question everything. While other officers were content to coast on tradition, Simons was obsessed with the future of warfare. He devoured books on German tactics, studied the latest theories on tanks and artillery, and spent endless hours imagining how battles would be fought in the next Great War. When World War II erupted, Simons was still a young major, just 36 years old, but his relentless drive and sharp mind set him apart. By 1942, he was commanding an entire division. By 1944, he was the youngest corps commander in the Canadian Army, leading tens of thousands of men into the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. Simons' reputation was legendary, and not always in a good way. He was known for his icy calm under pressure, his ruthless attention to detail, and his refusal to accept anything less than perfection. Staff officers whispered that he had ice water in his veins. He demanded results, not excuses. He could be cold, even harsh, but he inspired a kind of respect that bordered on fear. In a world where connections and old friendships often mattered more than raw talent, Simons was different. He didn't care who you knew. He cared what you could do when the bullets started flying. But Simons was also a man haunted by the weight of command. He had seen firsthand what happened when leaders failed their men. In Sicily and Italy, he watched as promising plans fell apart because someone hesitated or made the wrong call. He learned that in war, there are no second chances. Every mistake is paid for in blood. That lesson shaped everything he did in Normandy. He knew that the lives of thousands depended on the decisions he made, and on the men he chose to carry out those decisions. For American viewers, Simon's story might sound familiar. He was cut from the same cloth as U.S. generals like George Patton or Omar Bradley, men who believed that leadership was about results, not popularity. Like Patton, Simons was a student of war, always searching for an edge, always pushing his men to be better, faster, smarter. Like Bradley, he understood the crushing responsibility of command, the knowledge that every order could mean life or death for the soldiers who trusted him. But Simons was also uniquely Canadian. He led a citizen army made up of volunteers from every corner of the country, farmers, factory workers, students, and shopkeepers. These weren't professional soldiers. They were ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Simons knew that their courage deserved the very best leadership he could provide. He refused to let old habits or personal loyalties stand in the way of victory. As the crisis at the Falaise Gap deepened, Simon's cold, analytical mind went to work. He studied every report, questioned every decision, and weighed every option. He saw the cracks forming in his command structure. He knew that if he didn't act, more young men would die, Americans, Canadians, and their British allies. The burden was immense, but Simons carried it with a kind of grim determination that set him apart from almost everyone else on the battlefield. In the end, it was Simon's willingness to make the hardest choices, the ones that would cost him friendships, trust, and maybe even his own peace of mind, that would define his legacy. He was the kind of leader who understood that in war, sentimentality is a luxury no one can afford. The only thing that matters is getting the job done and bringing as many men home alive as possible. But as the battle for Normandy reached its breaking point, Simons was about to face the ultimate test of his leadership. The next move he made would not only change the course of the war, it would change the lives of everyone under his command. The plan to close the Falaise Gap was bold, even by the standards of World War II. It called for a night assault, something rarely attempted on such a massive scale. Under the cover of darkness, more than 1,000 British bombers thundered overhead, dropping tons of explosives on German positions. The ground shook for miles, and the sky lit up with fire. For a moment, it seemed like the Allies had finally found the key to victory. The Canadians, using a brand new tactic, rolled forward in armored vehicles called kangaroos, essentially tanks stripped of their guns and turned into moving fortresses for infantry. It was a move straight out of a military innovator's playbook, and it caught the Germans completely off guard. By dawn, the Canadians had advanced farther in a single night than they had in weeks of brutal fighting. The trap was closing. American and Canadian newspapers buzzed with headlines about a possible end to the war. The world watched, breathless, as the Allies seemed poised to deliver a knockout blow to Hitler's armies. But then, in a twist that would haunt the campaign, disaster struck from the most unexpected direction. As the second phase of the attack began, American bombers, meant to soften up German defenses, accidentally dropped their payloads on Canadian positions. The chaos was immediate and devastating. The headquarters of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division took a direct hit. General Rod Keller, a key commander, was gravely wounded by flying shrapnel. In an instant, the division lost its leader, and confusion rippled through the ranks. The shockwaves didn't stop there. Units that should have surged forward instead froze, trying to make sense of the carnage. The 4th Canadian Armored Division, making its first major attack, struggled to keep up. Tank crews lost contact with the infantry they were supposed to protect. Traffic jams clogged the narrow French roads, turning the advance into a nightmare of stalled vehicles and missed opportunities. The Germans, sensing a lifeline, regrouped with astonishing speed. SS Panzer divisions, some of the most feared troops in Hitler's arsenal, set up deadly roadblocks on the high ground, forcing the Allies into grinding, close-quarters battles for every inch. Every hour of delay was a gift to the enemy. German trucks, tanks, and soldiers streamed through the shrinking gap, escaping the trap that had seemed so certain just hours before. For the Americans and Canadians, the frustration was overwhelming. The headlines that had promised victory now hinted at disaster. The world's greatest military machine was being outmaneuvered by a battered, retreating enemy. Simons watched the unfolding chaos with a cold, analytical eye. He knew that the bombing mistake was a tragic accident, one of those cruel twists of fate that happen in every war. But what happened next was different. The real problem wasn't the enemy or the fog of war. It was the hesitation, the lack of coordination, the failure of leadership at every level. Orders were late or unclear. Units reached their objectives but stopped, waiting for instructions that never came. The 4th Armored Division, despite its courage, failed to break through. The momentum was lost. For American viewers, this kind of battlefield confusion is a familiar story. Even the best armies can stumble when leadership falters. In Normandy, the cost was measured in lives and lost opportunities. The Germans, battered but unbroken, slipped away to fight another day. The chance to end the war early was slipping through Allied fingers. Simons understood the stakes. He saw that the problem wasn't just bad luck or enemy resistance, it was a command crisis. The men he had trusted to lead were failing at the worst possible moment. And as the dust settled over the fields of Normandy, Simons knew that something had to change. The next move would be his, and it would shake the Canadian Army to its core. But before he could act, the failures of the battlefield would force him to confront the hardest truth of all. Sometimes, the greatest danger comes not from the enemy, but from within. By mid-August 1944, the Allied dream of trapping the German armies in the Falaise Gap was slipping away. The battlefield was littered with the wreckage of shattered tanks, burned-out trucks, and the hopes of a quick victory. For American and Canadian forces, the frustration was almost unbearable. The world's most powerful armies had come so close to a historic triumph, only to watch thousands of enemy soldiers escape through a gap that should have been closed days earlier. The headlines in New York and Chicago shifted from triumph to questions. How could this have happened? Who was to blame? Inside his makeshift headquarters, Guy Simons faced the hardest decision of his career. The evidence was impossible to ignore. The bombing mistake that wounded General Keller was a tragedy, but it was only the beginning. The real disaster had unfolded in the hours and days that followed. Commanders hesitated. Orders were delayed. Opportunities were missed. The 4th Canadian Armored Division, led by Simons' own friend George Kitching, had failed to break through when it mattered most. The cost was measured in blood, thousands of casualties, and a victory that slipped through Allied hands. Simons knew what had to be done, but the price would be steep. In the world of military command, removing senior officers is a move fraught with risk. Careers are ended in an instant. Reputations are shattered. In the U.S. Army, generals like Patton and Eisenhower had set the standard. Results mattered more than friendships or tradition. But in the Canadian Army, where personal connections ran deep and the officer corps was a tight-knit community, such a move was almost unthinkable. Yet Simons was out of options. He understood that the next battles would be even harder. The Canadians would have to clear the ports, cross rivers, and fight their way into Germany itself. Every mistake would cost more lives. He could not afford to send men into combat under leaders who had already failed the test. The burden of command meant making decisions that would haunt him for the rest of his life. On August 21, 1944, as the last shots echoed across the fields near Falaise, Simons summoned George Kitching to his headquarters. The two men had shared years of service, training, and even friendship. But now, Simons delivered the news with cold finality. Kitching was being relieved of command. The 4th Armored Division had not performed as required. Opportunities had been missed. The division had failed to show the speed and aggression that modern warfare demanded. Kitching would be reassigned, his combat career over in a single, silent moment. Simons didn't stop there. Brigadier E.L. Booth, who commanded the Armored Brigade under Kitching, was also removed. The failures of coordination and momentum traced back to his leadership. Even General Keller, wounded by friendly fire, would not have survived in command. Simons had already lost confidence in him long before the bombing. Across the Canadian ranks, other officers were quietly reassigned, their reputations protected but their careers effectively ended. What made Simons' actions so remarkable wasn't just the ruthlessness, it was the way he did it. There were no public scandals, no headlines, no political explosions. The removals happened quietly behind closed doors. Officers were treated with dignity, their service acknowledged, their names kept out of the newspapers. The Canadian Army closed ranks, protecting itself from political fallout and sending a clear message to every commander still in place. Results matter. Connections, excuses, and past glories would not save you. For American viewers, this kind of accountability might sound familiar. The U.S. military has always prized results over reputation, especially in times of crisis. But for the Canadians, Simons' purge was a seismic shift, a new standard that would ripple through every level of command. The message was clear: deliver victory or step aside. Simons carried the weight of his decisions in silence. Those who knew him said he became even more withdrawn, more clinical after Falaise. He had ended the careers of men he respected, men who had tried their best but fallen short. The pain was real, but Simons believed it was necessary. The lives of thousands depended on it. The Canadian Army would never be the same. And as the dust settled over Normandy, a new era of leadership was about to begin, one where only results would matter, and the price of failure would be paid in full. The shockwaves from Simons' decision didn't just ripple through the Canadian Army, they sent a message that echoed across the entire Allied command. In the aftermath of the Falaise Gap, the Canadian military was transformed almost overnight. The old rules, where connections, seniority, and tradition could shield an officer from consequences, were gone. In their place was a new, uncompromising standard: deliver results or step aside. For American viewers, this shift might sound familiar. The U.S. Army had already learned, sometimes the hard way, that victory demanded tough choices and ruthless accountability. Inside the Canadian ranks, the impact was immediate and profound. Officers at every level understood that the days of second chances were over. Brigade commanders, regimental leaders, even junior officers, everyone knew that their performance was under the microscope. The message was clear: the lives of your men, the success of your mission, and the fate of the entire campaign depended on your ability to lead under fire. There would be no more hiding behind friendships or past achievements. The only thing that mattered now was what you could do when it counted. But the consequences weren't just professional, they were deeply personal. For men like George Kitching and E.L. Booth, the end came quietly but decisively. Careers built over decades were finished in a single conversation. There were no public accusations, no humiliating headlines. Instead, the Canadian Army handled the removals with a kind of cold mercy. Officers were reassigned, their reputations protected, their service acknowledged. To the outside world, it looked like routine wartime shuffling. But inside the ranks, everyone knew the truth. Failure had a price, and no one was immune. This silence served a purpose. It protected the Army from political backlash back home, where news of scandal or infighting could have undermined public support. It spared the officers and their families the shame of public disgrace. And it sent a warning to every commander still in the field: you are only as good as your last battle. For American audiences, this approach mirrors the quiet, behind-the-scenes changes that often happen in the U.S. military, where results are rewarded and failure is dealt with swiftly, but not always publicly. The transformation didn't stop at the top. The new commanders Simons put in place, men like Major General Harry Foster and Brigadier Robert Maunsell, were chosen for one reason: they had proven themselves in combat. They understood the stakes. They shared Simons' relentless drive for results. Under their leadership, the Canadian Army became leaner, sharper, and more aggressive. The difference was felt immediately on the battlefield. Attacks moved faster. Objectives were taken on schedule. Coordination between units improved. The army that emerged from the Falaise crisis was fundamentally different from the one that had gone in. But the cost was real. Friendships were broken, trust was shattered. Simons himself became even more isolated, carrying the burden of his decisions in silence. Those who served with him noticed the change, a colder, more distant leader, haunted by the weight of the choices he had made. Yet for all the pain, the results spoke for themselves. The Canadian Army's performance in the battles that followed, at the Scheldt in the Rhineland and across the German frontier, proved that the new standard worked. The Army was more effective, more professional, and more respected by its American and British allies. For the men on the ground, the changes were felt in every order, every attack, every hard-won victory. Soldiers who had once doubted their leaders now found themselves following officers who inspired confidence and demanded excellence. The lessons of Falaise became part of the Army's DNA, a legacy of accountability, professionalism, and the relentless pursuit of victory. And as the war moved on, the story of Simon's decision faded into the background, known only to those who had lived it. But its impact would shape the Canadian Army and its relationship with its American allies for generations to come. The transformation that followed Simon's bold decisions was nothing short of remarkable. The Canadian Army, once plagued by hesitation and missed opportunities, now moved with a new sense of urgency and purpose. The next great test came quickly, the Battle of the Scheldt, a brutal campaign fought in the flooded fields and icy waters of the Netherlands. Here, the lessons of Falaise were put to the ultimate test, and the results would silence any remaining doubts. Under new leadership, the Canadian divisions attacked with a ferocity and coordination that stunned both their enemies and their allies. The 4th Canadian Armored Division, now commanded by Major General Harry Foster, pushed forward through impossible terrain, keeping relentless pressure on German defenders. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, rebuilt after the loss of General Keller, fought with a discipline and determination that had been missing just months before. Every attack was sharper, every maneuver more precise. When one unit stalled, another surged ahead. When opportunities appeared, commanders seized them without hesitation. The cost was staggering, nearly 13,000 Canadian casualties in just 6 weeks, but the objective was achieved. On November 28, 1944, the first Allied convoy sailed into Antwerp, opening a vital supply line that would fuel the final push into Germany. Military historians would later point to the contrast between Falaise and the Scheldt as proof of how leadership can change the course of a campaign. Where once there had been confusion and delay, now there was clarity and momentum. The Canadian Army had become a force to be reckoned with, earning the respect of American generals and the gratitude of Allied soldiers who depended on those open supply lines. But the story didn't end on the battlefield. For the officers who had been removed, the years that followed were filled with hard lessons and, in some cases, redemption. George Kitching, the general whose career had been cut short at Falaise, spent years rebuilding his reputation. He served in staff roles, contributed to training the next generation of soldiers, and eventually commanded Canadian troops in NATO. In his memoirs, Kitching admitted the truth that many leaders struggle to face. He had been promoted too quickly, given too much responsibility too soon. The fault wasn't entirely his, but he accepted that the consequences were real, and that Simons had made the right call. For Rod Keller, the story was more tragic. Wounded in the chaos of friendly fire, he never returned to command. His final years were marked by silence and obscurity. A once promising career ended not by the enemy, but by the unforgiving demands of war. Yet even in these stories of loss, there is a lesson for every American and Allied officer. Leadership is not just about glory or ambition. It's about responsibility, accountability, and the willingness to make the hardest choices for the sake of those you lead. Simons himself became a symbol of this new standard. Admired by some, feared by others, he was never a household name in the United States or even in Canada. But among military professionals, his legacy was clear. He had shown that results matter more than reputation, that the lives of soldiers must always come before personal loyalty or tradition. His approach echoed the best traditions of American commanders like Patton and Eisenhower, leaders who understood that the price of failure is always paid in blood. For the men who fought under the new command, the difference was real and immediate. Letters home spoke of renewed trust in their officers, of attacks that made sense, of victories that felt earned. Veterans who survived the Scheldt and the Rhineland campaigns would later say that the Army felt different, tougher, smarter, more determined to win. The lessons of Falaise had been learned, and the price paid in Normandy was not forgotten. As the war drew to a close, the Canadian Army stood shoulder to shoulder with its American allies, a transformed force forged in the crucible of hard decisions and costly lessons. The story of Symonds and the quiet revolution he led remains a powerful reminder. In war, as in life, true leadership is measured not by popularity, but by the courage to do what must be done, even when the cost is high. In the end, the story of Guy Symonds and the Falaise Gap is more than just a chapter in Canadian military history. It's a lesson that echoes across every American battlefield, from Normandy to the Pacific, and into the heart of every command post where lives hang in the balance. The choices made in those tense days of August 1944 reveal a truth that every U.S. officer, soldier, and citizen should understand. Leadership is not about comfort, popularity, or tradition. It's about responsibility, sacrifice, and the willingness to make decisions that may never be fully understood by those outside the line of fire. For Symonds, the burden of command was never just about tactics or strategy. It was about people, about the young men from small towns in Ohio, Texas, and California, as well as from farms in Saskatchewan and cities in Ontario, who put their trust in their leaders. Every order he gave, every change he made was weighed against the ultimate question: would this bring more soldiers home alive? In the U.S. Army, this same question has haunted generations of commanders, from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of Vietnam and the deserts of Iraq. The lesson of Falaise is clear: results matter. In war, there are no participation trophies. The enemy doesn't care about your connections, your years of service, or your good intentions. The only thing that counts is whether you can deliver victory, and at what cost. Symonds' willingness to remove even his closest friends from command sent a message that still resonates in American military culture. Accountability is not optional. When lives are at stake, sentimentality is a luxury no leader can afford. But the price of command is steep. Symonds paid it in broken friendships, sleepless nights, and a legacy that was respected but never celebrated. The officers he removed were not cowards or traitors. They were men pushed beyond their limits by the chaos of war. The system that promoted them too quickly shared the blame. Yet, as every American general knows, the battlefield is unforgiving. There are no do-overs. Every mistake is paid for in blood, and every hesitation can mean the difference between life and death. For the soldiers on the ground, the changes Symonds made were felt in every attack, every order, every hard-won victory. They may not have known the details of what happened behind closed doors, but they knew when their leaders were up to the task. Trust was rebuilt, confidence restored, and the Army moved forward with a new sense of purpose. The same is true in every American unit that has faced adversity and emerged stronger because leaders had the courage to make the hard calls. Today, the story of Guy Symonds is studied in military academies from West Point to the Royal Military College of Canada. His legacy is woven into the fabric of Allied military doctrine, a reminder that the true measure of a commander is not in medals or monuments, but in the lives saved and the victories earned. For American viewers, this is a story that transcends borders. It's a call to remember that leadership, at its core, is about doing what is right, not what is easy. As we look back on the fields of Normandy and the narrow escape at Falaise, we are reminded that the price of command is often paid in silence, in sacrifice, and in the quiet knowledge that you did what had to be done. For Guy Simons, and for every American commander who has faced the same impossible choices, the answer to the only question that truly matters is this: did more soldiers come home alive because of what you did? In the end, that is the legacy that endures. A cold comfort, perhaps, but an eternal truth about the cost of leadership in war.